Chapter 27, Section 5, U.S. troops face difficult conditions. Initially, much of the pressure on LBJ came from hawks in Congress and from the military, who called for more troops in Vietnam. LBJ wanted to fight a limited war with a limited number of soldiers. The American public, he believed, would turn against him if he allowed troop levels or casualties to rise too high. By 1968, most of the ground troops in Vietnam were not professional soldiers like the Marines who first landed at Da Nang. As the war progressed, more and more of the fighting was done by men who had been drafted into the army. Many of them took a dim view of the war. In a letter home, one draftee summed up the feelings of many soldiers when he wrote, "We are the unwilling working for the unqualified to do the unnecessary for the ungrateful." This attitude toward the war reflected the difficult conditions that U.S. soldiers faced in Vietnam. Fighting in unfamiliar territory. One set of difficulties had to do with the geography and climate of South Vietnam. Few American GIs had ever experienced such hot and humid conditions. In some areas, temperatures rose above 90 degrees Fahrenheit much of the year, and heavy monsoon rains fell from May to October. One GI recalled his reaction upon landing in Vietnam, when the plane door first opened. The air rushed in like poison, hot and choking. I was not prepared for the heat. This uncomfortable tropical climate also gave rise to a host of insects and other pests, as well as diseases like malaria. Perhaps the greatest geographic challenge for U.S. soldiers, however, was Vietnam's rugged topography. Troops had to march through soggy lowland rice paddies and swamps and over steep jungle-clad mountains. The heavily forested terrain often made it difficult to locate the enemy. Unlike U.S. soldiers, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, knew this land intimately and were skilled at concealing themselves in the dense tropical vegetation. In an effort to deny the enemy its forest cover, the U.S. military sprayed chemical herbicides from the air. These herbicides stripped the foliage from plants and killed many trees. The favorite herbicide was Agent Orange, named for the color of the barrels in which it was stored. The military sprayed Agent Orange along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and in many other areas. It also used herbicides to kill crops that might feed the enemy. However, this spraying had a limited effect on enemy operations because the forest cover in Vietnam was so extensive. It also contaminated the soil and water, destroying civilian food sources, and exposed civilians and soldiers to toxins that posed long-term health risks. Engaging an elusive enemy. As the United States escalated its commitment to the defense of South Vietnam in 1965, the Viet Cong and NVA realized that they could not match superior U.S. firepower. To win, they had to engage in guerrilla warfare, relying on the element of surprise and their skill at disappearing into the landscape. The ability of the insurgents to avoid detection frustrated U.S. commanders. Besides concealing themselves in the jungle, Viet Cong and NVA soldiers often hid from their American pursuers in underground tunnels. Some of these tunnels had several exits, which made escape easier. Others were even more elaborate, containing living areas, storage spaces, and even kitchens. The Viet Cong also had the ability to hide in plain sight. A South Vietnamese peasant tilling the soil by day might be a guerrilla killing Americans by night. GIs passing through a small village could not tell friend from foe. They could trust no one, not even women or children. To counter these guerrilla war tactics, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, decided to fight a war of attrition, a military campaign designed to wear down the enemy's strength. The United States hoped to eliminate so many enemy troops that the Viet Cong and NVA could no longer fight the war. The chief tactic in this strategy was the search and destroy mission. Small units of soldiers called platoons would search out insurgents and draw them into a fight. Then, they would call in an airstrike by helicopter gunship or jet fighter bombers to destroy the enemy force. This search and destroy tactic appeared effective when measured by the enemy body count, the number of soldiers killed. Communist deaths far exceeded American losses. For Westmoreland, the body count became the key measure of U.S. progress in the war. Search and destroy missions, however, made U.S. combat soldiers clear targets for enemy attack. Insurgents frequently ambushed platoons as they marched through the jungle. Snipers or sharpshooters sometimes picked off U.S. soldiers from concealed locations. Soldiers also fell prey to landmines, explosive devices buried just below ground that blew up when stepped on. Men on patrol also had to watch for booby traps, such as tripwires connected to explosives and sharpened stakes coated with poison. Many soldiers managed to overcome these challenging circumstances. They served with distinction and carried out their combat duties as required. Others, however, became severely demoralized. During their 12-month tour of duty in Vietnam, some soldiers focused solely on survival, avoiding combat when possible. Low morale also led to increased drug use. The limited war proved ineffective. The United States had reasons for pursuing a limited war. First, General Westmoreland believed that a war of attrition could achieve victory. The goal was to kill more enemy soldiers than North Vietnam or the Viet Cong could replace. If the strategy worked, the communists would have to give up eventually. Through limited war, Westmoreland thought the United States could achieve its main goal of establishing a democratic South Vietnam. Second, U.S. leaders saw grave dangers in pursuing a total war with no limits. Total war calls for the complete mobilization of a nation's resources to achieve victory. This approach would have meant invading North Vietnam and forcing the communists to surrender. It would likely have led to an enormous American death toll. Also, China and the Soviet Union, which were providing military aid to North Vietnam, might be provoked to intervene directly, potentially resulting in a nuclear confrontation. The limited war proved ineffective, however, because the strategy of attrition failed. There were simply too many enemy forces to eliminate. Ho Chi Minh had once warned the French, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and I will win." The same held true a decade later. Some 200,000 North Vietnamese men reached draft age every year. Westmoreland's annual body counts never came close to that figure. The war continued, and anti-war sentiments began to grow in the United States. Most Americans could not tolerate a war, especially an undeclared war, that seemed to drag on endlessly at a growing cost in American lives. Ultimately, Americans underestimated their enemy. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese saw the United States as another colonial power that had to be expelled from their country. They were determined to fight on, no matter how long the war took or how deadly it became. The commitment of the United States to the war was much less certain.